Hello, Jerry Appert with Compliance Architects here, and I'm joined by Teresa Gorecki and Ken Ray of Compliance Architects, and we're talking about quality culture and Compliance Architects' new Quality Pulse diagnostic offering related to quality culture. And Ken, I thought I'd open the conversation by asking you first and foremost, in general, what is Quality Pulse all about?
Quality Pulse is a research-based diagnostic that's been designed not only based upon a wide variety and of well-established research and literature in the culture area in large organizations, it's also been adapted uniquely for the regulated environment of life sciences. It measures the health of your quality culture in that space and helps leaders identify key tipping points where actions can be taken to improve your culture.
All right, thanks, Ken. And Teresa, when I think about tools like this, I start to think about how do they apply? How do they help companies? And what are typically the use cases that we might see for a tool like this, like Quality Pulse?
I think the use cases are basically wide. This tool can be used in a variety of settings. It can be used at a corporate level in a large company. It can be used at an operating unit level. It can be used at a plant level. It can be used in small companies, and it can be used in large companies. I'm currently, as a consultant, working with a number of startup companies, and I find that Stephen Covey had a great notion in mind in his 7 habits. Begin with the end in mind. I think one of the advantages a small company starting out has is they can actually take the Quality Pulse survey to understand what their baseline is. What are the messages in their company? What are the behaviors they're seeing? How do they evolve their systems and their processes and their procedures so that they support the development and evolution of a mature quality culture? I think in a large company, it's appropriate at any time to go in and certainly assess the pulse, gain a diagnostic on what the culture of quality is in the organization. I certainly think in companies that have had unpleasant health authority observations, challenges with the FDA in the CM&C or clinical section of their submissions, I think the moment you start to get negative feedback from a health authority is an excellent time to really understand your quality culture. But I think it's sad to wait until that point, because having been in a presentation recently with Ken where we had worked the diagnostic tool with one of our clients, there is a point where you can become quite toxic, and the actions that you need to take become quite complex and can take a very long time. And I think the sooner that you begin to get the pulse and understand the culture of quality in your organization, I think the sooner that you can address things as they emerge. Many cultures take cultural diagnostic tools, employee involvement tools, and such throughout the year. I think it's interesting to maybe consider taking Quality Pulse with some level of frequency to understand your baseline and then how your culture is evolving in terms of the messages that are being delivered officially, the unofficial messages that exist within a company, the unwritten rules, the unofficial norms, the behaviors that exist, and then looking at the adjustments you need to make to your processes, to your systems, and your tools to be able to enable the output and the outcome that you'd really like.
And that's really helpful, Teresa.
A quick follow-on to that, Jerry.
Yeah.
And I think, Teresa, you described very accurately a number of the business environments where Quality Pulse could be of use. There's also some different perspective on different contexts. For example, you mentioned when a company is under regulatory stress, Teresa, in that may be a good time Quality Pulse to give you some valuable information. But there's also things, we've worked with clients who are doing systems improvements.
Oh, yeah.
Your knowledge of the culture helps you understand how well that systems improvement will have uptake and actually anchor into the culture and be successful in attaining the outcomes you want to obtain. Yep. We've worked with clients, Teresa and I have, of startup, rapid growth companies that are still defining what their culture may be. And understanding your baseline, you're bringing new people into the organization. They're bringing with them their own culture from whatever company and experience they've had. How do you go through that? Or a company that has a new scale issue. They've got a new product that's coming to scale. They have to scale their systems up. How do you scale up culture? Some people call that change management, but it's actually culture. Merger acquisition. You're bringing two cultures together. Those cultures may be very strong, but they may be very different. How do you work those out instead of just dealing with let's blend the systems through integration planning? That deals with your systems and your procedures, but it doesn't deal with the behaviors and belief systems of the two populations that come into that company. And then, of course, you've got a company under stress, whether it be regulatory or even financial stress. If you've got stress due to a gap year, and you may be inadvertently sending financial signals that says quality is less important when it really isn't. It's probably more important during those periods of stress.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different contexts which Quality Pulse offers a great deal of value to keep business focused on its outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Yep.
Right. No, it's great discussion. And, when you think about all of the different applications and use cases that you both articulated so nicely, maybe one of the questions I start thinking about is, well, what makes this different in terms of quality culture as opposed to just a culture-based assessment? I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are out there in the market space around cultural assessment tools. Quality Pulse really does focus on quality culture specifically. Can we talk a little bit about that in terms of what makes that unique?
Sure, I'll take that one, Jerry. There's a great number, as you mentioned, of culture assessments. Some are developed within the company, some are provided by third parties. Those deal with a generalized business context and are applicable to a wide variety of industries, whether it be sales, development, manufacturing, et cetera. What's unique about Quality Pulse is we've taken that body of research and a lot of that understanding of behavioral context in an organization, and then adapted it into what we all know is a structured regulatory framework for life sciences. The regulations for both pharmaceuticals, biopharmaceuticals, devices, combination products, those regulations are diverse, they are specific in some cases, and they put operating constraints around how things are done. You have to have certain systems in place in order to meet the regulation and do your business. Those constraints have to be accounted for in the culture model because they constrain behavior and drive uptake of beliefs of what's important. Quality Pulse has built that into it, so we understand that operating context that's unique to life sciences. So that's how it differentiates from those general, what are often HR and leadership type culture assessments.
Right.
What I like about the tool that has been developed beyond what Ken has said is the fact that we focus on behaviors. We ask a lot of very pointed questions against scenarios to ask people what they observe in their environment. What are the messages in their environment? What's being said versus what do they see and what do they hear? If you think about being a new employee in a company, when you come in, there's everything you read in the procedures and the policies and all the things that you're trained on when you're in a regulated type environment. And then you get to budget season or performance review season or other periods of time, and you ask your peers, what's really important here? What's the real scoop, right? What's the real skinny? What does the boss really want? And, I find that interesting because as this tool has been developed, what differentiates our tool from some of the other quality culture surveys out there, frankly, is many of those are talking about the suitability and the applicability and how well the quality system as it's designed is executed, right, Ken? And what ours does is not focus on how well your quality system's designed or how well people are executing CAPA. It asks things like, so when you need a CAPA in your company, does your boss put the best people or the worst people against the CAPA? And how high on the priority list is the execution and the completion of that CAPA? And what's the expectation about the robustness and thoroughness of the root cause investigation? So based on the experience Ken and I and others have had that have been involved in the development of the tool, what we know about quality culture is it's all about what people do and what you see and what the boss says and does and how that's different from the slogans on the wall and the official messages and memos that come out and all of that sort of thing. Right, Ken?
Absolutely. You touched on one point that I recall from our many discussions in the development of the tool, how we had to pivot and become acutely aware that this is not an audit. This is not trying to assess the health of your quality systems. We've all done audits. We all see what those are. And there's plenty of great audit. Most companies have their own internal audits, and there are people who do those audits. That's a context, but it's not what we're getting at. We're looking at what's driving behavior, and belief drives behavior, and systems provide context.
Yes.
That's a unique perspective that I think Quality Pulse brings that no one else does.
Correct.
It's not benchmarking. It's not seeing how well are we doing against our peers. That's interesting, but it's not driving improvement in action.
Correct.
Right. You know, you both talked a bit about the orientation of Quality Pulse to life sciences. You know, perhaps one of the questions I have is there a particular segment of FDA-regulated industry that where Quality Pulse may fit better than in others? For example, is it more oriented to pharmaceutical or biopharmaceutical versus medical device? You know, is there a particular industry orientation that plays well for Quality Pulse, or how broad can it go from an industry perspective?
Oh gosh, I think, Ken, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but frankly, I think this is appropriate for biopharma companies, pharma companies, regulated consumer products companies, folks in the device business, folks in the combination product business, certainly the emerging technologies like cell culture and gene therapy. I think the generic companies can benefit from this. I don't see a segment of sort of the life science regulated industries that this doesn't apply to. Ken?
I totally agree. And that's what we had in mind, going back to begin with the end in mind, is that we didn't want to focus in on a particular segment, pharma, biopharma, device, because we saw commonality in they all operate under systems, and those systems are assessed to be in an audit. But those systems and the messaging within those organizations drive beliefs, what people believe is important, and belief drives behavior, and behavior reinforces belief. And that's how cultures can grow and get stronger. It's also how cultures can start to spiral down and get weaker because of that interaction of if you have bad culture or weak culture and they continue to see reinforcement in a negative way, the culture can continue to degress.
The other thing I think, Jerry, is it's important to know that measuring quality culture is important from preclinical through clinical development, through commercialized products, the entire life cycle of the product. There's applicability here in understanding the messages, how well the behaviors and the unofficial messages and the norms are congruent with the messages and with the strategy of the organization. And of course, all of those organizations have the usual challenges: the need to make money, the need to make timelines, the need to have patient satisfaction, the need to have case fill rate and unit fill rate. All of these things in one way or another. Is my patient enrollment on time? All these things against what the message is, what the talk is about quality culture officially, safety, all these compliance aspects, right?
Absolutely. Speaking of
what do we see?
And while we're on the topic of scope, you made me think when you mentioned applicability to commercial versus clinical, to even some of the other pharma life cycle stages.
Yeah.
There's also an aspect that needs to be considered when you talk about the scope within a client.
Yeah.
Are we looking at a single site? Are we looking at multiple sites within a common region that have commonalities but differences? Correct. Are we looking cross-culturally, cross-continental, Europe versus North America versus Asia? Do you have those abilities to see influences of local customs and local culture outside of the business?
Yes.
Belief systems within local culture, the impact of language becomes important. Those things also drive the scope determination and how effective Quality Pulse can help you understand what may be influencing differences between sites, differences between regions and operating companies, et cetera.
Yep.
Right. So we've covered a lot. We've talked about the breadth and depth of application and use cases. We've talked about the range of industries where this can fit in. We've talked a bit about the tool itself and how the design and the question set gets to so many things that influence and affect culture. Let's talk a bit about the output, because I think a lot of our friends and clients are certainly interested in methods and approaches, but at the end of the day, what do you get out of this? What is the data, the analytics, the results, the visuals? Talk a little bit about that, Ken, in terms of how this works.
The analytics are very powerful, and we had a lot of conversation and really forward thinking design into that analytics in building what we call a robust data model. And the underlying analytics of that, we work with each of our clients to understand what it is you're looking for and insights about your organization. We do that upfront during pre-launch interviews. What are the segments? What are the subpopulations within the scope of the engagement? What that allows us to do is to explore question by question. We get a response. We're able to see the response to that question. Is it favorable? Is it unfavorable? Is it symmetrical? Is it asymmetrical? Is it broad? Is it very narrow? How strong is that signal relevant to that question, favorable or unfavorable? If it starts to become very broad and you have a large number of favorable and unfavorable, it's kind of a mixed result, we can then dig in at literally the click of a mouse to see what are the subpopulations that are driving that aggregate analytic for that question. Are there subpopulations that believe one thing and another population believes something different?
Yep.
You've got dissonance there. We can then start to say this question, because we understand how these questions are aligned to your business operating systems and areas of the business, as well as what's driving behavior, we can then start to look at related questions. These 3 or 4 questions get at one aspect of your culture. Are those populations starting to show a similar beliefs across multiple questions? What's driving that? And then we can start to get into some real informative conversations with our client to understand what the data is telling us, and then they can contextualize it further with their own comments, as well as our ability to do robust analysis on the actual open text responses, which is a whole nother topic we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, what I like, I think, Ken, that we've done is we're able to really, what I call zoom in and zoom out, right? Mm-hmm. We're able to start at a very top level and provide for folks those couple of things that probably are the best about their quality culture and the biggest opportunities in their quality culture. But we are then able to split the data and look based on how they choose to set up the quality pulse. We can look by function, by unit, by area. And as we've looked and done some report outs with clients, we've seen big diversity between operations and quality. Sometimes in places where we thought we'd see diversity between those two organizations, we saw a lot of harmony and alignment. Mm-hmm. We can see differences between engineering and facilities and maintenance versus production. We can see differences between the laboratory and other areas of quality. We can see differences between what tech transfer and R&D think versus what the operating supply chain unit thinks versus what compliance thinks. It's actually really nice to be able to look. We can also look at employee tenure. The longer someone's been with a company, what do they think? We can look at levels in the organization, right? From top to bottom, bottom to top, and in between. Those things, when you're trying to really diagnose and look for opportunities, being able to analytically and in a very nice and succinct way summarize that data for management, because let's face it, leaders make decisions based on data.
Right.
They don't make decisions based on discussion.
And you described very nicely the vertical. We can also go horizontal. So you can find one level in that vertical. So you want to look at a certain level or a certain department. that population, we can then start to look across questions and see, what does rewards and recognition look like? Or
Right.
what does handling quality incidents look like within that population? So we can go both horizontally and vertically across any of those populations and get almost a snapshot of any segment we want to, or aggregate it in just about any way we want to see where related groups can respond and what their responses are. And that's just on the score data.
Yeah. And I think one of the most challenging things we faced is, as we've talked about quality pulse to some clients or potential clients, we will hear, well, the problem is at the plant level. The problem is with middle management. The problem is with, somebody else, not me. And it's interesting because when we then execute the quality pulse with those organizations, we're able to come back and show them what one of my fondest VPs of operations used to say all the time: fish go rotten from the head down.
And what's
so I
really
think
been
it's very insightful to be able to share that with people and help ground them in where some of the issues really lie and what people really perceive in the organization.
So you mentioned a good point, Teresa. Makes me think of what's been one of the most rewarding things in having those client conversations is when I've come into a project, particularly with one of the clients you're consulting with on systems work, I've come in with no insight into what's going on at the plant.
Yep.
We have the conversations to set things up. I'm in essence blinded to what's going on and what the culture is, and we've tried to maintain that separation there,
independence,
and that independence, and see what the data says, where we're not misinterpreting things. We've gone in with that blindness, set up the survey and the diagnostic, gone through and analyzed the data and reported out. And I think on our last client, it was a consensus around 10 or 12 people of literally and figuratively everyone nodding their head. That pretty much sums it up. That nails it out. That sums it up. It was not any if then well this, maybe a little bit, maybe that, a little fudging around the edge. It really wasn't. It was, and we were pretty candid in some of our remarks. We pointed out some good things. We pointed out some things that can need work, and focused on things of action. But it was remarkable how accurate it was for someone with no knowledge prior to doing the assessment to be able to say what's going on among the individuals. And that's also relied upon a great deal of data that we collect, not only in the score data we just described, but in the open text responses.
Yeah, and then the expertise that you bring to looking at that data, right? Because frankly, if you hadn't worked in the quality and compliance field and worked, for the number of years that you've worked in industry, you would not also have the expertise and insight into, what some of the signals are that are coming through in some of that data. The other thing that was, I think, fabulous in that last report out to the client that we did was the ability to take the analytical data from the questions that ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, unfavorable to favorable, what do you think? We have these open write-in questions, and we're able, through some tremendous analytical capability, to sort of validate what we're seeing in the numbers. Mm-hmm. So when we get people that are sort of sometimes challenging the numbers, or they kind of look like they have a question mark on their forehead and they're wondering, right, about the numbers, you're able to pull up the information from those verbatims. And I love the Wordle that we have. We have actually created a Wordle from many of those questions to really look at what are the major sentiments in this given scenario in the organization. And that is a very powerful tool to use in a report out with leaders. Very powerful.
It really adds the depth and color of it. And probably it bears some discussion for those listening of what we're actually referring to. The survey itself consists of what's called a Likert scale, where you have an agree to disagree scale and some scenarios. And that's been the scored data that we talked about the last few moments. In addition to that, Quality Pulse has a series of open response questions, something that no other quality survey actually has. And we actually ask the respondents to put into their own words, what about this? Describe and describe. And it's 10 to 15 questions that are strategically placed throughout the questionnaire while things are fresh in their mind while they're responding to the agree-disagree questions. As they add to those, what we've found is people won't write simply a single phrase.
No.
They will write 2 phrases, 3 phrases, 4 phrases.
Sometimes.
And out of those 16 questions and hundreds of respondents, we will literally get thousands of individual statements, which we parse out and do sentiment analysis on and natural language processing. That allows us to process that large bolus of data and actually bring it down and know what to focus on. We can find what are favorable sentiments, what are unfavorable sentiments, and on what topics those unfavorable sentiments on, and then start relating them back to the scored data. And the color commentary that we're able to link up through that methodology is just astounding. We've been really pleased with how that works.
Yeah.
Ken, maybe talk a little bit more about what a typical project looks like. I think we've talked a lot about some of the things that come in, the things that come out. But if you're looking at what a typical project, and knowing that no 2 client situations are, of course, exactly alike, but what do we typically look at when we're looking at a project?
Up front, there are some very open discussions with each client. Understanding what your business needs are, what you're trying to achieve, and level set on expectations. That's what we call the pre-launch meetings. We find who are the stakeholders that we need to involve, make sure we've got a good alignment between those stakeholders around expectations, desired outcomes you're trying to achieve with this, buy-in where people will take it seriously, roll that into a communications plan where we get sufficient messaging out to our respondent audience that, yes, this is important. Your response is important. We are listening to you. Make sure that anchors into the target audience that we're looking at. We have some more tactical questions of who is your target audience. We spend several discussions on what are the analytics you want to get out of it. We'll often get into what's the HR information system stack and work with HR teams to see what information is available on the respondent population, and then what do we want to do our assortment on, sorting out and analytics on. Do we want to include departments, regions? How does that roll up organizational data? Do we want to get into education? Do we want to get into years tenure in the company, years experience? Other things that you might want to report on that would influence your culture and what may be driving the belief systems of your employees. We look at the target audience. How low in the organization do you want to go? Do you want to go to hourly workers all the way up to the VP or some subset in the middle? How broad do you want to go? Multiple sites, single site, et cetera. And once we have all of that information collected and we get a data file on what the respondents are, data around what you want to report on, we'll then execute our comms plan, start working to launch the survey, collect the data, close the survey, move into a data analysis phase where we give an initial readout, usually within the first couple of weeks post-close, go into a deeper dive of that data to really start looking at subpopulations, give some depth and color to it, have the initial report outs, and then follow up as the client would like on informing the stakeholders who were engaged at the early part of it, and then get into action planning. That's kind of the soup to nuts until you get to action planning, and action planning is going to be based with each client.
Mm-hmm.
And with all that, what are we looking at typically in a time frame?
Time frame, the pre-launch can go relatively quickly on a few caveats. One is the availability of that, what we call the respondent data file of who's in your populations and the availability of metadata in basically an Excel spreadsheet output from your HR systems. If that data file is there and you have approvals from your HR system and any other compliance or privacy concerns, we always want to touch base with our IT security, HR partners to make sure that we maintain confidentiality and security and allowing people access to the site to take the survey. That can take 3 to 4 weeks. can be squeezed. It can stretch out depending on that availability. The survey runtime is up to the clients and how large of the scope is. If it's a very large deployment across thousands of people, we may actually want to work that in tranches and do separate scopes, just where it's not as burdensome on your IT systems, and we're not trying to process so much data at one time. We can break it off into bites. We can handle it each time. And then at close, again, if you have larger amounts of data, we talked a little bit about some early readouts. Those come out pretty straightforward, but we want to make sure they're contextualized. We do the data quality on the back end to make sure the reporting's good. So start to finish can be as short as 8 to 10 weeks. More comprehensive, larger deployments, probably 12 to 14 weeks.
Yep.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Teresa?
Yeah, that's been our experience.
Okay, great. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. Teresa, do you have any other thoughts that you want to share around quality culture and quality pulse?
I think, Jerry, my final thoughts around quality culture and quality pulse are, understanding whether management's walking the talk. And I know that's a trite statement and it's been around a long time, but I think understanding whether management's really walking the talk and getting at that constant conflict between managing the business outcomes and the business metrics versus achieving quality objectives and ensuring smooth regulatory approval processes and health authority inspections, and really focusing on those things that are going to give you consistently a good quality product, reliable supply, a good development pipeline and process. I think it's really important for a company to understand that, because my experience after 30 some years in industry, frankly, is that companies that don't have really strong quality culture, it shows in the rest of those metrics. They miss financial hurdles, they miss milestones, they've got drug shortages, they've got intermittent back order, they've got high rates of nonconformance or reject. It shows up in all the operational, financial, and other timeline program management metrics in one way, shape, or form. You have a lot of really high level metrics in an organization that can be green, and what sits under those is a lot of red sometimes. And you actually end up with what I call the watermelon scenario. I had a boss at one point who used to talk about watermelon metrics. Everything at a high level would be green and everything under it would be chaos and a mess. And it was interesting because a lot of that had to do with quality culture. The mess on the inside had to do with the culture and had to do with, we either had great messages and people weren't walking the talk. We didn't have good enough, strong enough, consistent enough messages, and people were trying to do the right thing. And then often you will have systems or processes that are not in place to enable a really good quality culture. So, my general perspective is it always shows up somewhere in the numbers. And the more time that the leadership team or the board or the management team has to spend trying to muscle their way into their numbers and their commitments, the more time you have to spend doing that, the more time you should spend looking at your quality culture, frankly.
Right. Ken, I'll just go back to you then. Any further thoughts from you before we wrap things up for today?
Yeah, reflecting on what Teresa said, I'll expand on a couple of quick points very briefly. When I sat in the plant as quality lead for a manufacturing site, one of the most difficult things in that role was you were working on systems, you were trying to improve those systems, responding to audits, updating your procedures, all those things we normally do, managing the metrics, et cetera. And you were trying to get leadership on board and messaging things. And you could do both of those things really well. And there was this something in the middle you couldn't put your finger on, that they weren't connecting. People were following the procedures at rote and saying quality was good, but it really didn't connect. And we kept hearing culture for all through the 90s, the last 20 years or so. Culture's been re-emphasized as, yeah, it's important, but we don't really know about it. Well, I think what Quality Pulse has done is connected those two together through behavior.
Yeah.
Is that the systems remove friction and make your doing the task you're asking your employees to do easier, makes them more efficient and more effective.
Yeah.
And you can tell people what's important, but if that piece in the middle that connects them, the behavioral piece, we've obliquely referred to it as walking the talk, and we've heard that for decades as well. What Quality Pulse helps you do is find a way to connect that what's driving behavior in a way that will improve your systems and improve your messaging and connect the three to where they're all synergistic. All the systems tie together. We've talked about quality systems, the integral interconnectedness of quality systems for decades now. Quality systems, the FDA came out with that in the 90s of how they're all interconnected. But it doesn't really get into the culture piece. And now I think we've got a handle on how to connect those things and be able to pinpoint where you can take action to connect them together within your own culture context, business context.
And frankly, FDA is very interested in culture. They've been dancing around this discussion, right, Ken, looking at quality metrics, how they can assess risk, and they've identified, if you look back at warning letters, there was a period of time decades ago where management was never mentioned in a warning letter. And then we moved into the 90s and the early 2000s where, management and the head of the quality unit, so to speak, were often referred to in a warning letter, right? Mm-hmm. And FDA has become more and more and more interested in quality culture because I think what they're learning is this thing that they can't describe in a 483, but you can kind of feel and sense inside the company when you're auditing and you've been there a long time. It's this untangible thing you can't wrap your arms around. They're trying to find ways to understand that and measure that because I think what they've seen over time is that quality culture and the appreciation and the ability to do not this or that, but this and that is what makes a great company great.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Teresa, Ken, thank you very much. And thank you. Bye-bye.